Hi, this is Paul. David Fuller, who runs Rebel Wisdom, and Andrea Lewis, who has her own small YouTube channel, did a conversation that Andrea just released today. I'd done a conversation with Andrea a couple of months ago or so. And, I mentioned on Twitter that Andrea she's Benjamin Boyce is sort of a mentor of hers, and the connection between them is interesting because she's sort of got this warm naivete that she enters into these conversations with, and it's very unarming, and it tends to bring out a lot of candor and honesty in the guests. Not that David doesn't have candor, but I thought this was an amazing conversation, and I wanted to butt my big nose into it and talk about what they talked about because, David, David and Ali came and visited me and came to Living Stones, and actually David talks about that at the end. And I wish Andrea hadn't interrupted him because I'd love to debrief with David on that sometime, because I think there's a lot that the church can learn by listening to very honest, sensitive, self-knowing people like David learn about ourselves in the church. But so David and Ali came to Sacramento, and I did a conversation with them early on in this whole business. And of course, my church was just kind of surprised by this. What is their crazy pastor doing on the internet anyway? And where's I going with that? And so David, David over at Rebel Wisdom. He and I sort of had in some ways the same response to Jordan Peterson and his rise. Dave sort of a new insight into Christianity. I, of course, already from Christianity, thinking about it. But there was this, when Jordan Peterson, in the early days, Jordan Peterson, again, the timeline is October 2016. Jordan Peterson releases a sort of a video screed about Bill C-16. And then over the next few months, the world sort of finds Jordan Peterson. And it's not the political aspect of Jordan Peterson's rise that I've ever been very interested in. It's much more of the religious, social, pastoral aspect, let's say. And I think David and I are very much on the same page in that. And David, in his Rebel Wisdom channel, which has been quite successful, and I'm deeply appreciative of, has, in many ways sort of been the chronicler of a certain aspect of the IDW, and especially the aspect that I'm most interested in, which is not the political, but much more. Again, I would call it the pastoral. David does, what, for lack of a better term, is called men's work, and he's very committed to men finding a better way of working their lives, and not only women as well, but again, that's sort of been the focus of his work, he and Ali. And that of course is, from a older church perspective, very pastoral, because churches have been very interested in men's work right from the beginning, and churches have noted in many ways how difficult it can be to work with men, and that might come as a surprise, because churches are supposed to be patriarchal and male dominated, and yeah, that's certainly been true. But in church, we have two Bible studies, a morning and an evening women's Bible study, and these Bible studies go on for decades with very little attention from me, and they're stable, and they're welcoming, and they're just wonderful. But until I started doing a Jordan Peterson meetup, having men come in for Bible study or something like that just never worked. And so I sort of began doing men's work via Jordan Peterson. And now, again, Jordan Peterson's rise comes in October 2016. And now, as we're at the beginning of 2020, it's a good time to sort of pause and do some summing up. There's a viewer right from the start began watching me, and I've been exchanging emails. I've wanted to do a live conversation with him for quite a while, and he's I always say that YouTube is a place for people with little to lose. And he's been reticent. And many good people, in fact, don't want to come on camera and necessarily have a public conversation with me because they have something to lose. And there's risk in doing what I'm doing. But, he challenged me to do some thinking about what have I learned over the last 2 years. In fact, I've had a number of those conversations recently. So I found this conversation to be tremendous between David Fuller and Andrea Lewis, and I want to do a little bit of commentary, a little sharing on it now. But first, I got to arrange my office a little bit. And as always, there are links below on the YouTube page and on the podcast page. Andrea has a small, she's about 1,300 YouTube followers right now, and so not a very big channel, but people come on it, and she's disarmingly warm. I think that's a good way to describe her. And so let's jump into this conversation that she had with David.
Listeners, and there was a paradox. As soon as the New York Times article came out, I think it fundamentally shifted.
This was the New York Times article about the IDW, and again the intellectual dark web, named by Eric Weinstein. I was
that in quite a meaningful way, because it was no longer dark. Therefore, the dynamic changed, and in some sense, yeah, it's a kind of paradox. And in the naming of it, it kind of stopped being the thing that it was, or it became a kind of paradox of itself, I'd say.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way, but now that you say that, well, naming something, at least in like ancient traditions, I know is sort of giving power to it in a way. So it kind of gave it the power, it took away the underdog in them. Maybe. Yeah. So, okay, because I'm trying to think of where, because we could continue on in what this one vein, because I do want to talk about, because you said what it was, and then I do want to talk about it now. But can we talk about, just for a quick tangent, about our mutual friend Ryan Bennett's idea of IDW protocol, which is the concept of it being a sort of like scientific method of free thinkers.
Yeah, I think Ryan's onto something there. So he's a programmer, so he was seeing it very much as if the IDW is a network, how do you understand a network online? You understand it through, for example, the internet, you understand it through HTTP. I don't know what those words stand for, but there's protocol, the protocol.
Hyperlink transfer protocol.
Something hypertext protocol or something, I think, but basically
hypertext or hyperlink. I might have got it wrong. I'm a pastor, not a programmer.
You understand
David's a filmmaker, not a programmer.
The web by understanding how the computers communicate with each other and what that becomes. That there's an emergent property of the individual computers that is called the internet. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't try and understand the internet by studying someone's hard drives.
Right.
So he's saying the idea of understanding what the IDW is by looking at the individual contents of each person's philosophy is the wrong idea. What actually we should be doing is saying what are the principles that are underlying the IDW conversations. And he came up with three, which was, I think, one was if you value ideas more than identity, you're in the IDW. Maybe we can bring them up on screen now. I can send you I've got the tweet that we can have a look at.
Yeah, let me look.
Just to give a bit of background for people. So Ryan was at one of the original, the Unconference. He was one of the organizers of the Unconference, which was when the Pangburn New York event in November last year didn't happen. Ryan took on basically organizing an event for all the people who'd already paid to be there, and that they called the Unconference. And what that kind of showed, which was also worth noting, is that the kind of people that are following the IDW conversations are quite an anti-fragile group of people. Like when they realized the conference wasn't going to happen, a group of them organized an event anyway in New York for people to come together and talk about the ideas. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there is this thing.
And I after my talk with Carl, I really have a desire to read the Nassim Taleb. I haven't read any of him yet. But what David says here about, my experience with our local meetup group is very true. At one meeting, someone said we should all come in with our big 5 numbers, and so some of us did, and we went around the room, and what we discovered is we had a number of people that scored 0 on agreeableness, and they're some of our core members of our local meetup. And that anti-fragile is very much a big part of our local meetup and our local group. And I think David is right that the IDW sort of selects for people who are going to be contrarians, and I find that in terms of the people who watch my channel as well.
I've said this before about Jordan Peterson, and I think it's true of the IDW, because there's quite a negative perspective on it in the culture. I think it selects for people who are prepared to be quite free thinking and disagreeable, because they're prepared to, like, if you're going off what a lot of the kind of mainstream media are telling you about someone, then you're probably not going to, if you're more of a kind of herd thinker, you're not going to sort of follow that rabbit hole. But if you are more of a free thinker, you probably would do.
Right. Please go, take it away, David.
Okay, so it's just opening up here we go. When you pursue truth instead of power, you're in the IDW. When you favor understanding over judgment, you're in the IDW.
Okay.
When you value ideas more than identity, you're in the IDW.
I heard those 3, and of course I had to follow up and follow Ryan and dig a little bit deeper into some of the stuff, and I look forward to Andrea, I keep calling her Andrea. Andrea has a conversation with Ryan that I haven't watched yet, but I very much want to watch it, because I love those 3 things, because actually I think they are in fact deeply Christian. And well, let's keep I'll pause, add something. I didn't make much of a video. I didn't make much of a PowerPoint for this, so I have to pause and pull in some things. And a little bit of a back and forth with Andy B on Twitter about this, because I talked about how David, and Ryan, very much share, I think, when I listen to David talk about the IDW, I hear him talking about things that I've felt about it. I told David this interview might have been done a little while. David didn't remember what he had said, and I said, you don't remember because you live it, David, and he really does. And that's why it isn't striking to you. Talking to David, basically, you embody it on your channel and in your life. The world is better because you're in it, David. Thank you. And then Andy B said, what do you mean by the heart and the dream of the IDW? And I wrote, a space for nuance and disagreement, flagship leaders who facilitate the flourishing of the small in the grassroots. A community not only of healthy disagreement, but even of awkward disagreeables. And I went on to say, maybe I'm so passionate about that because for me, those are values that I have of the church. And I fear that in many ways, sort of the big box celebrity church, which is, I can't say it's dominating because it really is a minority, but it dominates the mental landscape of what church is. And of course, anybody who visits my church will find, it's small, not always agreeable. Again, a community not only of healthy disagreement, but even of awkward disagreeables. And in some ways, our local meetup is exactly that. Oh, now I gotta find the browser. Here we go. I gotta get to the right tab.
I see. There they are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are sort of things. I
think it's a really clever idea because even from the beginning, when the IDW was just considered to be this group of, 10 or 15 people, I think that was very limiting because there's clearly a groundswell of people who are interested in the ideas and want to have these conversations. We've done live events in London where one of the questions we've asked people, we've either shown a bit of a film or done a talk, and then the audience of say 80 people, we've kind of invited them to get into small groups with each other of like 6 to 8 people, and then said, ask them what topics do you feel that you're not allowed to discuss, or what opinions do you feel that you don't feel safe discussing in public. And that's a really like amazing thing for people to people feel a real sense of freedom and yeah, just a kind of sense of relief that they have a space to be able to talk about that.
Right.
We wouldn't necessarily say talk about that subject. It's like, just what subjects do you feel that you can't talk about? And the way we do that is to say at the beginning, we ask for confidentiality. We say,
it's so funny because when I hear David talk about this is all church small group stuff that we've been doing forever. And I'm not going to say the church invented it or anything like that, but social science and church work have sort of been, swapping things back and forth for a very long time. Often just churches pulling right from social science, because pastors and churches are often trying to figure out, how can we do small groups better? How can we facilitate sharing? How can we facilitate community? How can we facilitate openness? Also, just a little shout out to a friend of mine. If you live in the Nashville area or in the Santa Barbara area, there's a little outfit called Nuance Forum that a friend of mine has started. Look around for announcements on Meetup, because he's very much doing similar things. He's not sort of doing it under the Jordan Peterson umbrella like how my Meetup got started, but some of these values that David is talking about very much is valued in that Nuance Forum. And at some point, if my friend wants to, I would probably have David Fuller have a conversation with him, because he's very much part of this larger effort.
We're going to create a space now where we'd like you to raise your hand if you agree that you can talk about your experience, but not what anyone else shared. So we're kind of trying to create a safe space,
right?
Which is kind of ironic.
Safe space, no.
Brett and Eric also say that the IDW is an attempt to create a safe space for conversations, because bad faith in this environment, or someone who's prepared to use kind of identity as a weapon, or to kind of misquote you, or to kind of play to the crowd. The biggest issue I see in these debates on stage is playing to the crowd. Because that's kind of how this ideology wins, is by trying to get saying something that they think will get like virtue signaling on stage, and then the crowd kind of joins in, and that right. Seems to be what derails on-screen debate.
Now David Fuller and Dave Rubin have had some conflict, and that gets talked about quite a bit in this video. And my issue with some of the Jordan Peterson live events and how Dave Rubin would tend to open them was that playing to the crowd was exactly what he would do. Now I understand he's trying to warm up the crowd and so on and so forth, but that playing to the crowd is tremendously dangerous. And I'm not saying it's always wrong, but it's really hazardous stuff. And when I've taught preaching to people just learning how to preach, this is something I almost always warn them against, because what it tends to do is you draw a circle around the group and say, here's us, we're the holy ones, those people out there, that's the problem. And in Christianity, the issue is so often, no, the problem is in here. The problem is in me. The Christian faith begins with that admission that I am the problem. And so this in-group, out-group dynamic, which is so easy to get going and can be so productive in building a following or building a movement. And this is, again, so much of this goes, if you read the Gospels carefully, you can see how Jesus doesn't do this. How Jesus gets this enormous following in the Galilee and rejects it. And this comes out in John chapter 6, where Jesus will not play to the crowd, and the Gospels say again and again, because he doesn't trust the crowd. And he doesn't trust the crowd, not only because of individuals in the crowd, but because of the kind of psychology that happens with crowd. Now, a little bit later in this video, they'll talk about tribes. And as with many things, we should up our resolution, because tribes are necessary and necessary for our functioning, for our survival. We can't live without tribes, but we always have to be cautious with them, because these same dynamics turn, and it's so often in these ways that humanity commits some of its greatest crimes.
Okay.
And I guess there's lower stakes when you've got people together in a smaller group, but there's definitely
and that's, what he says there kind of as a throwaway is so important too, because one of the things that will often happen in, say, church congregational meetings is that one of the things you learn very quickly is that churches can really kill themselves in their congregational meetings. That once or twice a year the whole church will gather, and this is a place for conversation, and as will often happen, somebody with a grievance or an issue or a personality issue will stand up, get the mic, and maybe do a lot of damage to the community. And one of the things I did early on here, because this church, before I got here, it had a bad history of that, was when we had discussions at congregational meetings, we'd break up into small groups to do the discussions, because you can easily get on to us and them talking to the back of people's heads. But when you're looking at people face to face, and you're looking at the relational, emotional, and reputational impact and consequence of your words, you will speak more graciously and more kindly and with more love, hopefully, so that you don't tear the relational fabric that churches and communities require. So that little throwaway line that David gives right there is very, very right.
Just to loop back to where we started, there's definitely a wider phenomenon that is wanting to be born out of this sort of IDW conversation.
Right there. There was a wider phenomenon wanting to be born out of this IDW conversation. I think David and I, and some will disagree, I think David and I will agree that this didn't reach its potential. Now something was born, and right away when I saw what was happening behind Peterson, and those of you who have been following my channel a long time know I talked a lot about this early on, that one of the things that, let's say, Billy Graham, and now don't worry about the theology of Billy Graham, just look at the sociology and the strategy that the Billy Graham Association implemented. They were always thinking about all of the different levels, because all of these different levels, the small group, the medium-sized group, the large group, the non-face-to-face group, the media group, all of those different levels require different approaches. And so often, the way our commercial market-based society does is looks at big numbers and says this is the goal, because if we can gain big numbers, we'll make it up. We'll make it up in volume. This is how we'll bring in money. This is how we'll build a platform. This is how we'll gain a following. But the problem is that there's a huge status differential, and what you do is you tend to intensify the modernist. You tend to intensify the modernist dynamic of making people small. And in fact, I had a little conversation via Twitter Messenger with Andrea today, in that I said, don't disparage small things, because the old adage, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. There's a lot to that. Don't despise influence with a small group of people. Again, if you look at, I look at, who do I follow in this? I look at the work of Jesus. Jesus poured his life into, well, there's sort of a group, there were the mobs, there was the crowd, and it says again and again in the gospel, Jesus didn't trust the crowd. He understood what crowds are. So he didn't trust the crowd. They had sort of a group of 120, 72, and then down to 12, and then down to 3. And he poured so much of his life into a small group of people. And then those people would pour their lives into other people, because the truth is, again, there's so much. One of our meetups, somebody asked, have churches been studied? Churches have been studied at incredible depth using social science tools, and a lot of this learning about groups. So you have the vast majority of churches in North America have 75 people or less. And then you have sort of this between 75 and 200, and 200 and below is considered the small size church, because that's about what you can manage in terms of face-to-face relationships. And 1,000 and more is the large size church. And the dynamics of a large church are very different. And large churches will often have small groups that try to take into account all these different group dynamics. But then those middle-sized churches between 200 and 1,000, that's been sort of the rough spot in churches, because it's too big for everyone to have a face-to-face relationship with one another, but it's too small to get some of those large group dynamics going. And so you really have to look at all of the different levels for this if you want to build a movement that can change the world. And, well, I'll let David continue, because this is where they go with this conversation.
And that's one that a lot of norming, definitely a wider phenomenon that is wanting to be born out of this sort of IDW conversation. And that's one that a lot of normies want to get involved in, like people who don't have millions of people following them on podcasts. And that's the thing that I think the IDW members have not done enough to
cultivate.
To cultivate. Thank you. Yeah, cultivate. Exactly. I think if at the beginning there was some kind of strategy for promoting more of a grassroots movement to discuss ideas, and there was an opportunity to do that, probably that opportunity was partly lost because of what happened with Pangburn.
Now this is very interesting, and you do a little bit of Googling about what happened with Pangburn, but again, I don't know that, Pangburn was facilitating large celebrity-driven events, and with Vervaeke and our little corner of the internet, we've also continued to talk about the value of meetups, the value of getting together. So in March, when I go on my little tour, up the West Coast, we might have one event that has a few people. It won't be very meetup-like, but the other events will be meetup-ish. Because, again, as a pastor, I know the limitations of the large group strategy, okay? And the large group strategy affords certain things, but also discourages different things. Now, I think YouTube and ubiquitous video have changed a lot of things, and I think they've broadened the bandwidth so that you not only hear my words, you see my face if you're watching, so there's a lot of this stuff going on. But the thing that I find most gratifying, I've said this a number of times in a number of ways, are the relationships that are built between the people. Because it's those relationships that actually scale in terms of what is needed for life. It's the friendships. It's the trust. We don't, basically trust is the lifeblood of relationship. If trust is wounded, relationships struggle. And if trust grows, relationships flourish. And so, there's this movement, everybody's watching Jordan Peterson and they're all disconnected, and immediately, and my friend in Nashville too, he saw this immediately too, and he found me quite quickly, and we had a mutual connection, and we started talking. I've never done a conversation with him online. He's one of these people that I want to do a conversation with online. If you've been to some of my meetups, you've met him. He's not in Sacramento, he's in Nashville. But we both saw right away that people would go to these large Jordan Peterson events and they'd say, who can I talk about this with? And I said, well, come to a meetup. And Jordan Peterson comes to Sacramento, and 2,500 or 3,000 people fill the auditorium. And it's so funny because here's this little meetup, and we get usually 12 to 25 that show up at each time. And every time but once over the last 2 years, we've had a brand new person walk through the door at every meeting, which, again, having done church work, that just completely amazes me, because church work, especially small church work, tends to be very steady. Once people get into the church, small churches are very sticky. And so people a million janitorial jokes just went through my mind. Small churches are very sticky in that people bond and they form community, and these things are really very important. Now, what also develops, however, is the reality that the more intimate, the closer people get, the more things arise that have to be worked through. And this we know from marriage, from families, because we like to imagine that, oh, intimacy is just this wonderful, beautiful thing. Well, intimacy is and closeness is difficult to maintain over time because we are who we are and how we are. And so what if there's actually a container that helps people stay together? Over time you begin to learn the skills and the practices that maintain community. And that's why a little bit of Twitter conversation went on about Dillahunty's divorce, and I am not going to talk about whether or not he should have been divorced, because in many ways everybody's marriage is a foreign country to absolutely everybody else in the world, and marriages fail, and sometimes divorce is the better option. But easy divorce always has consequences on down the line, and again, these issues just scale all the way in terms of people and their lives.
Like we're trying to do events now where we have high profile speakers, but then we also have a kind of more grassroots element as well.
See again, David and his background, both as a filmmaker doing doing news and this type thing, but also doing men's work. He has a better understanding of, okay, the scale here and why you have to manage it in this way.
Going on where people are able to speak themselves, and that there is a model that needs to be brought together. This is something again that Ryan's been working on with I don't know if you know about the app that he and a few friends have been together called what's it? It's like Speaking Together, or
I don't actually know the name of it. I was gonna maybe beta test it, and then I kind of forgot to to be like, hey, I do want to. But I know he's been working on that.
So his idea for the app is that when you're going to an event, say a Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talk, you will sign up to the app, and then it will link you to other people who are going to the same talk, and then you would have a meal beforehand or a meal afterwards, and you'd have a talk about the ideas.
Very churchy.
Cool.
And it would sort of which is really, and then you could use that could be attached to any debate or event or talk that you would then sign up and be matched up with other people who are going.
And now in many ways that's people hear that, oh, that's a great idea. But then when it happens, you realize, oh, now I'm going to talk to strangers. So all the extroverts are going to be like, oh, this will be fun. And the introverts are just not going to do it. Because, again, people are hell as other people. People are, monkeys full of snakes. People are complicated. And you find this if you do meetup work, that, you're going to have to, you're going to have to steward the conversation. You're going to have to try and find ways of helping things happen. And this is where our consumeristic culture is in many ways shows it's a David Brooks a while ago, I don't remember exactly which word he used, but basically it's basically the culture of flaking out. If I go there and I meet people I don't like or I'm not going to stay there. Well, that's true and good for some levels of things, but it better not be true of everything in your life. You had better not be a consumer in every relationship that you have. Because I just saw there's a pastor who's in the region, and he got into some Twitter thing between marriage as contract and marriage as covenant. Part of the reason Christian pastors sometimes use the word covenant for marriage is a consumer relationship with the supermarket where I buy my food is a fine thing. A consumer relationship with my wife and children is not appropriate. my commitment to them needs to go beyond my customer satisfaction with the interaction. And I'm not saying that you should go to meetups that you don't like, and I'm not saying that any church that you join, you have to be there until the day you die. What you need is a spectrum of relationships, and you're going to have to find the intensity and to the degree to which these relationships are contractual and the degree to which these relationships are covenantal, and there'll be a spectrum in there.
Okay, and I can see that as the vision of what he's trying to promote with his IDW protocol. That he said, I remember him saying, like, I know I've lost for that being what it means, but I found it very interesting, and I think that now we're moving on to what it is now and maybe some critiques. So that
see about the warmth. You know, this is, and you see David's smile. This is part of Andrea's gift in this area.
That is my biggest critique, is that I don't know that it was knowing or unknowing. I'm gonna give the most charitable version of it. I think it was unknowing, unbeknownst to them, that they focused on themselves rather than on the ideas and, like you said, growing the grassroots of what they had started in a way. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, there was a definite trajectory to what happened. I think you can't really overestimate what impact the sort of Pangburn implosion had, because even the on stage event seemed to have stopped.
Right. I guess you're right. It is literally like how many events were canceled from him?
I think only a couple, but there was a sort of trajectory. So there were some events, for example, Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins, that were about quite significant things.
Now, this is, I think, it's an important thing, because it's very hard and very costly and very risky to do the kinds of big productions like the 4 nights where Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris with Brett Weinstein and Douglas Murray, those 4 events, it's huge. It's just very, very difficult to pull off. And, you know, from some of the stuff I read, Pangburn got over his head in some ways with some of these things. These are very difficult things to pull off, which is part of the reason that Jordan Peterson began to work with an organization that had the relationships and the capacity and the funding to do it. But once you get to that level, as you know, Owen Benjamin and all of the stuff that he talked about, once you get to that level, there are going to be compromises that come in, because those corporations are very much, they have a bias and they have an agenda that is going to send you down a certain way. And, you know, this is the whole Dr. Oz thing with Jordan and publishing. You know, authors know about this in terms of publishing. Every level have these things to deal with. You know, I made a clickbaity title for my Carl Gruner conversation, and, you know, agnostic Carl destroys Sam Harris, and you know, I do that for fun. Should I do it? I don't know. And Dave actually talks about this a little bit later in terms of as someone who puts out videos, he knows in a sense how to juice the video to appeal to these limbic system glandular dynamics that all of us have, but he has an appreciation for the danger of that. And so Pangburn, of course, very much had an agenda in terms of kind of this modernistic celebrity atheist, celebrity apologist event. And you know, in my conversation with John Vervaeke, I talked a little bit about if there's, I don't know, I look to Jesus in the Gospels to learn about these things. And what I notice with Jesus is it is not true that Jesus never said a sharp word against anyone. Jesus had a way of talking that got attention, and had a way of talking that got attention and has held attention for 2,000 years. Socrates had a way of engaging that got attention. And so I'm not going to dismiss that. But if all you're doing is pushing people's buttons, or, see, this is where Jesus and the crowd, those dynamics come into play, because Jesus did draw the crowd, but you often see, he'd heal someone and say, don't tell anybody about it. And then they go and tell everybody about it, and that causes more. So Jesus is always trying to manage these things. And, the few times when Jesus actually sort of does things in a nakedly provocative way. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem is one of those episodes. The cleansing of the temple is another one of those episodes. Jesus used those episodes judiciously. So I'm not going to say that those are things that people can't play in, but we ought to have wisdom in how and when we use them. So if Pangburn had not stumbled in the way that he did, would the IDW, would this thing that Jordan sort of lit, could it have continued to build momentum? Because sort of what happened is Jordan sort of lit it, and then it sort of, so that the stakeholders didn't really fuel the grassroots and say, okay, we can run up our numbers, or we can also look at some of our, invest some resources now to build grassroots. And again, if you look at the Billy Graham organization, they figured out how to do both. And as I said many times in many of those early videos, churches have been working in this kind of stuff for a very long time because the church has been around for a long time. So all of that wisdom is in the institutions. And so you will find churches learn how to do these things, because you realize that they do need to be multi-level, and you do need to sort of work on these dynamics. It has to be engaging enough to get attention, but not engaging in the way that is going to cause you trouble down the line, because what you catch them with is what you catch them to, is another old pastor saying.
Mm-hmm. There were significant points at issue in evolutionary biology, because that's the other side of the IDW, is that I know from the films that I've made with Eric in particular, for him the IDW is just the media facing arm of a much wider conversation that needs to happen. His perspective is that so many areas of human knowledge have become stuck at the same time, from physics, which has gone down a kind of a wrong turn with string theory, to evolutionary biology that has kind of got stuck as well, and that there's many other areas of human endeavor which have got stuck at the same time for much the same reasons, which is that we tend to, or structures that evolve around a certain view tend to then police themselves against outsiders who have heterodox opinions. So the idea of heterodox opinions being the thing that we desperately need in so many areas of the world and of academia right now is...
No, I find this part of the conversation very interesting, because obviously he's using church language. When he's using heterodox, well, this is the language of church. And one of the interesting things about Christianity is, as I've made the point before, Sam says I'm maybe making Alistair McGrath's argument in his book Heresy better than he is, but church orthodoxy is discovered in the process of heresy. And if there's one thing that the church has shown, that Christianity has shown no sign of not being able to continue to produce, its heresy and heterodox ideas. All along in the life of the church, we've seen this dynamic, heterodoxy, orthodoxy, back and forth, conflict. The genius, I think, of Tom Holland's book Dominion is that more than, and there's a guy I want David Fuller to talk to. You should definitely have a conversation with Tom Holland, because I think the genius of Tom Holland's book is that he has found a way to sort of capture this dynamic of Christianity on both sides of a conflict. And, Jonathan Pageau also has a way of, in his symbolic world, has a way of the center and the fringe, of the right hand and the left hand. And obviously, churches in a confessional environment prefer sort of a monolithic win. We all prefer to win, but it's part of this dynamic. And I'm not really trying to point out Hegel here. And later in this conversation, David will talk about Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics and that mapping. And I know a little bit about it. I should really know more. There's a lot I'm trying to learn. I tend to be a little hesitant about certain Hegelian process ideas, because whereas I think this dynamic is very true, it, like the rest of reality, is more complex than we are capable of actually representing in our minds, which is part of the reason that symbolism is so important, because symbols are able to manage complexity in ways that subtle definitions don't. But here again, symbols have a way of managing this complexity. But at the same time, you also need propositional, carefully defined articulation. And especially in a realm like this where we're talking back and forth to one another. One of the interesting things is, and I think John Vervaeke very much understands this, that part of the irony of trying to regulate propositional knowledge is that we have to do it propositionally. And so John's 50 hours is full of propositional work, because that's basically one of the few ways we can do it within writing, within talking like we're doing. Now YouTube sort of expands it so we can have a little bit more imagery, but that's the nature of it. And ironically, sort of the same way, Jonathan Pageau via YouTube explains propositionally symbolism, which is sort of the other side of the propositional. So you've got all of these dynamics going on. Now, where was I going with this? I was talking about Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics, and so let's just keep it playing, because I forget exactly where I was going with it.
If that's true, then surely there needs to be some strategy in terms of, okay, these are the people, these are the conversations that need to be had.
Right.
These are the like, I'm not seeing enough of that either from, like, if that's what the IDW is based around, I don't see too much thought given to, okay, what are those issues and what are the topics and what are the conversations that need to have. And
here's another duality, sort of a centrally planned thing, or sort of a crowdsourced, none of us are smart enough to figure this out, that sort of thing. And the IDW has been sort of like that too. In a way, the rise of Jordan Peterson sent him to the front of it, and it sort of gathered around him, and many sort of rode his coattails up through that. And I certainly rode the coattails of Jordan Peterson to whatever degree I have any status. David certainly did. I mean, David was right there in Jordan's living room early on doing a film about him. David caught that early on. Yet then sort of when Jordan, I think, if one were to strategically look at, to look at what happened with Jordan, I mean, the book tour, did that help or did that hurt? And then you can look at, the organization that managed that. How did that change it? And so David say, there's no sort of hierarchy around the IDW to lead them. And again, looking at the Billy Graham organization, so you had Billy Graham and they had a hierarchy, but don't forget that when we're doing this in the context of the church, we have thousands of years of wisdom that we are leveraging.
we might see more of that from, for example, Eric's podcast.
Right.
That I know that he's got some. I haven't spoken to him for quite a while, but I know just listening to his podcast, he's got quite a few plans for where he wants to take it. So maybe that's his vision,
right.
And maybe that's his vision more than anyone else in the IDW from the beginning, because only really. It's also true that pretty much, like, Joe Rogan seemed to back away from the whole idea of the intellectual dork web, as he called it, very soon after.
He thought it was lame.
Well, but yeah, he thought it was lame, and it kind of is for him. He's a fighter. He's a really cool guy.
I love this segment of the conversation that they're about to have. And maybe it's unfair because some of you, I'm sure, haven't watched the conversations. You should very much go to Andrea's channel, subscribe, watch this in full, watch the conversation she has with Ryan. But again, Joe Rogan is interesting in this. But what you're looking at is you got a guy like Eric Weinstein, and you got Joe Rogan, and they can converse back and forth. But each of them has their own gifts. Each of them has their own strengths. Each of them has their own weaknesses. And what you're doing is you're trying to hobble something together, leveraging the strengths and weaknesses, but there's no leveraging them or putting them in the box. I mean, probably one of the big leadership moves that Eric made was to name it. But then, of course, when it gets named and written about in the New York Times, then it changes. And
he's kind of being lumped in with all these dorks suddenly. So it's like, oh, yeah, I'll be part of it because I like you, Eric, and that sounds cool. But maybe I'm not going to kind of go too hard on this. And he's got his own thing as well.
Yeah, I feel like he's embodied the spirit.
And Jordan Peterson would not be Jordan Peterson if he hadn't been on the Joe Rogan show. Because I'll tell you, I talked to a lot of people who have come through this thing, and a good percentage of them said, I first heard Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan. For all of the talk about the end of old media, it still has tremendous power and tremendous volume. And that can't simply be dismissed.
Spirit of what, I don't know about everyone, but the spirit of what I initially thought it was, he has embodied, because he's
Joe Rogan.
Free and open conversation with all sides. He goes to all of, even including far left as well as far right.
Yeah.
Right?
It's paradoxical. I think that's a really good point, because Joe Rogan's definitely would never class himself as intellectual, but I think that he's far more true to because he knows what he doesn't know, and
he will receive criticism, right?
Yeah. You saw him, especially with the interview he did with Jack Dorsey, and you saw him get a huge amount of criticism, and then on the next interview, I think it was with Sam Harris, you saw him thinking aloud of, wow, what did I do? I did something wrong. I got a load of criticism, and I never expected.
Totally agreed with them. Yeah.
Totally agree with them, and he also acknowledged that I just sit down and talk to people, and I've realized now with the people who are following me and the amount of traction I've got, that my job's changing, and I now am being held to account in a different way. And he took that on board, and he did another interview with Jack Dorsey where he invited Tim Pool in, and that's categorically different. I've been critical of Dave Rubin quite a bit. I did an interview with him that was quite where I was quite strong and fair, I think, because I think Dave Rubin doesn't do that. I think Dave Rubin is narrative driven. It's kind of ironic, because part of Eric's criticism of the need for the IDW is the fact that the mainstream media has become narrative driven.
Yeah.
Dave Rubin is hugely narrative driven. He's only really interested in the flaws of the left and frames everything within that, and also frames quite extreme figures as being much more mainstream than they are by not challenging them and actually kind of being kind of dishonest about their real views and their real perspectives. But the thing with Dave Rubin, and I'm going to sort of speak openly about it because I think that's the values of what the IDW is. Dave Rubin is very, very thin-skinned and cannot handle criticism, and that makes him far more. I mean, he's not an intellectual either, but it makes him much more dumb than he needs to be, because he can't take criticism, and he sees anyone criticizing him as being a personal attack. And that's really, really dangerous. I think it's actually very, very dangerous, because the more he frames anyone who criticizes him as being bad faith, the more that enhances the division, the more that creates the kind of polarization that, at its best, the IDW is about kind of moving beyond. But I think the way that I see Rubin can't take criticism, and then anyone who criticizes him, he frames as a bad person, and that's really dangerous, because it just continues the dynamic of these people are bad and these people are good, which is, I think, at the root of a lot of the division, a lot of the polarization that we're seeing.
Now, if you throw on the Tom Holland mask, what he'll notice is, he would notice this is, I think, the genius of his book Dominion, is that there's a both sidesness. There's an and sideness to Tom Holland. I think Tom Holland would say this critique that David Fuller just gave of Dave Rubin. He's basically saying he's lacking character, and this is very much Christian character that we would want Dave Rubin to exhibit, where he could, one of the things that kept coming up in my mind through this conversation was the prayer of St. Francis. I should just pull that up. Now, if you've hung around churches for the last 50 years, you know this sort of camp song, this prayer of St. Francis. Some very famous singers have sung it. If you go to the Wikipedia page about the prayer of St. Francis, you'll find that you can't really find it past 1912. And so there's questions as to whether or not it came from Francis of Assisi. But, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring love. Where there is offense, let me bring pardon. Where there is discord, let me bring union. Where there is error, let me bring truth. Where there is doubt, let me bring faith. Where there is despair, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, let me bring your light. Where there is sadness, let me bring joy. O Master, let me not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in self-forgetting that one finds, it is in pardoning that one is pardoned, it is in dying that one is raised to eternal life. Deeply Christian. And apparently the golden sayings of Blessed Giles of Assisi seems to perhaps be, it's similar to, blessed is he who loves and does not therefore desire to be loved. Blessed is he who fears and does not therefore desire to be feared. Blessed is he who serves and does not therefore desire to be served. Blessed is he who behaves well towards others and does not desire that others behave well towards him. And because these are great things, the foolish do not rise to them. And there's, I sense, in a sense, long for this spirit in the IDW, and I think I saw elements of it that again, as David Fuller noted, didn't really come to the fore. And so looking at the, let's say the differences between, let's say, Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan. Rogan is just more secure. And so Rogan's clearly got positions. I think an aspect of the IDW that has been weak, and I guess I've tried to do what I can in terms of my contribution to it, is it's tended to be shy of the church and of Christianity. And later in this, I don't know how much of this I'm going to play because time is marching on. And this doesn't include David, because for David and Ollie to actually come to a service at Little Livingstone's church, my hat goes off to them. They did not have to do that. And they did. And they participated in good faith. And I have a world of respect and esteem for them both for doing so. But there's a sense that, well, the church... Who, let's say IDW B team. Is Bishop Barron in the IDW? Is Jonathan Peugeot in the IDW? I think it's easier to argue for Jonathan Peugeot because of the closeness to Jordan Peterson. What other Christians are in the Dave Rubin called, not Dave Rubin, but Dave Fuller called on, I was ordained as the pastor of the IDW in the comment section of Rebel Wisdom. That's where my ordination happened, in the IDW. But not a lot of I think hesitancy towards the church, and that was reflected in Brett Weinstein's tweet that Andrea brings up later in this conversation too. But these qualities that Dave is looking for, these are deeply Christian qualities, and I won't say exclusively Christian, okay? Because I think other wisdom traditions have in fact also exemplified and promoted these virtues. But this, in this part of the conversation, this is really what they're talking about. They're talking about virtue development.
On all sides, yeah. And that's something that he's, I suppose, the most guilty of it. But because I have, like, on Twitter, I kind of, not on purpose, have ended up coming in a space that's very pro IDW and quite critical of IDW people.
Yeah.
And by IDW, I mean those particular people. That's the way that it's come to mean from people who speak about it online. From what I've seen, is like when they say the IDW, they're specifically meaning those particular individuals that are part of it. And like I'm not part of it in their eyes. You know what I mean? Like those who are participating in the conversation aren't part of it. You know, according to Ryan Bennett, we can all be part of it, you know, in his IDW protocol. But from how, I don't know about how they think of it now, those who are part of the media front-facing part of it. But at least those who speak about it, they see it as those individuals. Anyway, so oh man, where I was going somewhere. So with this, so the critiques I see are not received by any of those prominent members. I've not seen anyone, like, I've talked about critique actually, like once, and like Brett retweeted it and was like, yes, anyone who wants to critique you in good faith, that's your greatest ally, or something like that.
And I do want to name Brett in this, because I sent out a tweet about this morning when I was tweeting about this video. I've seen that in Brett. Brett is, I really respect that in Brett. Brett is willing, and this comes through in many ways. This is part of why I got attracted to Jordan Peterson, and part of why I respect Brett, because there are videos. I mean, the thing that caught my eye about Jordan Peterson was the suspender video, because I watched how he was trying to relate to the students that were not behaving well towards him, and he kept his head. And the Kathy Newman conversation with Jordan Peterson was, again, that was one of these seminal moments in the Jordan Peterson wave that changed it. And Jordan Peterson can get short and snippy and combative and defensive. There's no question about that. But he also has the capacity to not do so. And I think when Jordan does get defensive, part of the reason he takes those conflicts so hard was he knows he failed. And that's trust me, I know that about myself too. But when you look at those videos of Brett trying to engage the students at Evergreen, I respect the man tremendously because of what I see in those videos. That is a very difficult place to be put in. And he tries to engage respectfully with those students, and above all, both for Jordan and Brett, because they know they are teachers and they know students, and they know these students are just beginning, and they haven't had a chance to accumulate wisdom. And as the institutions, again, this is a Vervaekian concern, as the wisdom institutions have declined in our society, you have students entering universities that haven't been formed by church and haven't been given at least too open whether or not they do so. They haven't been given a package and modeled wisdom by institutions and by people of wisdom. And so what I saw with Brett and Jordan was that they were right there being attacked, but they were loving those who were attacking them. And that is deep in Christianity. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing, as he's being crucified on the cross. And that is a Christ-like virtue that when I see it, I respect it. And I say there's something in these individuals that is praiseworthy. There's a degree of virtue and of character, and that is something that is precious and valuable, and something that ought not to be dismissed. And so this question about criticism that David and Andrea are talking about is, I think, central to it, and central to part of my hopes for what I'd wanted the IDW to become.
Yeah.
He agreed with me or something. I think I said that they're your greatest ally, and I used ally before I realized what comes along with that. But anyway, I meant if someone is your friend and they're critiquing you, that's a help, not a hindrance.
Right out of the book of Proverbs.
And then he retweeted it yeah, this is great.
The book of Proverbs and the Bible.
Great, or something like that. I don't want to pretend that he didn't say that specifically, but he said something along the lines of agreeing with it. But then I've never seen I don't want to say never, but I haven't seen personally a lot, other than through maybe Joe Rogan, maybe Jordan Peterson has been willing to hear out criticisms, but I haven't seen them be critique, great. And I say critique because that's the kind version of criticism, right? The good faith version. I haven't seen that being you know what? That's maybe something we can work on. Other than Joe Rogan.
Because it's really hard and it requires a lot of humility. And most of the time we just don't feel like it because our egos get in the way. And again, David's worked, with his men's work, with all of this ego stuff that they deal with. That's part of the work that they do.
And specifically being very open about it. So, what have you seen of that?
It's a really interesting question. There's lots of interesting points in there. I think there's something that Brett says, which is bad faith changes everything, which is very true. Because I see some of the criticisms do seem to be motivated by bad faith. But I'd love to hear a bigger discussion of this term bad faith. What does it mean? Because
Dave Rubin says that it's just everyone who disagrees with him. That's what it is to him.
Let's put Rubin to one side. I just want to cap off the piece about Rubin by saying why I think he's very significant. Firstly, because he was so important in the initial constellation of the IDW. Lots of the main really fascinating conversations happened on his podcast in early 2018.
Right.
And he identified himself very clearly with the IDW and has continued to identify himself with the IDW. So I think it is fair to focus on him. Mm-hmm. And there have been other critiques, like Kathy Young wrote a piece about the dangers of tribalism in the IDW that had 3 paragraphs about Dave, and he just really kind of let rip at her on Twitter. So it's happened quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But let's move away. I don't want to feel that I'm focusing unfairly on Rubin. I think I've said very clearly what I feel about him. And people watch my interview with him if you want to see kind of me putting those criticisms to him directly.
Right. Which you were very fair with, by the way.
I think so. Yeah. I think so. And then Sam Harris.
And that dynamic of going directly. It's Matthew 18 for those of you who are Christians and know your Bible. This is part of, if you have conflict with someone, go to them directly. Deal with them directly. It's, again, in a Tom Holland way, this is what's gotten into the culture.
And Eric had a really interesting conversation. I think it was one of Sam Harris's town hall meetings where Eric was in the audience, then he got up on stage, and they talked for quite a while about the criticism that they were getting and how they felt that the bad quality criticism that they were both getting was making them both worse at their jobs, because it meant that they were almost certainly negating good criticism, because they were just so inundated with bad criticism that they were basically now treating everything as if it was bad criticism.
Okay.
And that they were so unused or had experienced so little good faith criticism for such a long time that they didn't really know what it looked like anymore.
Oh, okay. I haven't
So
heard that. So that's
really
very interesting.
Yeah. It was a town hall that Sam gave a while ago, and I think it was a really interesting digression, really interesting discussion. And I think that's almost certainly true once you get to that sort of level of that number of followers on Twitter and that number of kind of that level of kind of cultural impact. It's very
And again, this is part of the problem of size.
difficult to take in criticism. But this question of what is bad faith criticism, I think, is a really interesting one to pull apart,
because that scale, that scale means you can get absolutely as much. The Book of Proverbs will talk about the dangers of praise and affirmation. At that scale, you can get as much affirmation as you want. I was watching Mark Maron's Netflix thing, and I really was interested in it first, and then it kind of got a little seedy, let's say. But, so he's dealing with his sex life as a single man, and he admits to one of his friends that he's sleeping with fans. And I thought, yeah, you're using your status basically to get sex, because if you've got enough of a following, there's no end to applause. A friend of mine, Rod, I've had him on the channel, Rod talks about the clapping gods. And as pastors, you know this, even a pastor of a small church, the clapping gods. Oh, pastor, that was a wonderful sermon. Oh, pastor, you were so helpful to me. Oh, pastor, you were right there when I needed you to be. Beware of the clapping gods. But then there's the critical gods. And the thing is, when you go up a scale, there's no end of the critic. And okay, so I've been critics of plenty of these people too. And maybe, I'm sure there are many times that I haven't done so generously. And again, that gets back into this area of, anyway. So there's the critics, and then there's the clappings. But the clapping gods, the Book of Proverbs says they're far more dangerous than the critic gods, because that ego gets inflamed, and pretty soon you can't hear anything, and the narcissism and the megalomania just take over, and that's spiritual death.
Because what does it mean to say that something's in bad faith? And how do you know that something's in bad faith? Because it's very easy for all of us to say, oh no, I'm not responding to that, that's in bad faith, if it feels like something's motivated by resentment. Like there's one critic that I have that kind of pursues me everywhere, that I feel he's motivated mainly by resentment. Mm-hmm. I kind of know what he thinks, and I don't want to engage with him. I only have one. I'm sure that Sam and Eric and the other guys have a huge number of critics who they feel are motivated by bad faith. But given the fact that almost nobody thinks they're motivated by bad faith, and right. If you have a disagreement with someone, no one's going to come to you like in a year's time and say, you know what, I was actually motivated by bad faith when I was criticizing you before. So what does the word mean? How do we define it? How can we measure it? Because otherwise, I see the word bad faith being used by people in the sort of center IDW space, being used in the same way that no platforming is used by people on the kind of intersectional left. Oh, I'm not talking, shouldn't talk to that person, they shouldn't have a platform. The word bad faith is one that has to be kind of, I think, teased apart and explained, and we need to kind of understand what we mean by that. I do recognize that there are times on some sort of very left-leaning YouTube shows, for example, where you get the feeling that the person is playing to the gallery. I think playing to the gallery, virtue signaling, is probably a good definition of bad faith.
Right.
But we need to unpack it, because and then I think we have to go into psychological realms to understand what that means. I would love to have that discussion with Eric or with Brett to see, how do you know when something's bad faith, and how do you define it? Because otherwise it just becomes a kind of catch-all way of avoiding engaging with a lot of people.
Right. And I'm sure at the level that they are at with the number of social media followers and whatnot, it's probably, it's definitely, I have no idea because I'm not there. You know, I don't know what it's like. I'm sure it would be very difficult to filter out these things, and
not filter out, but figuring out how to get the filter right. Because that's the question of bad faith, is they've got bad faith. Okay, that's a filter. So that's a signal I don't need to listen to. But how do you know if it's a signal you don't need to listen to? For a long time, in I think it was 2018, Jordan Peterson kept talking about, I have people who are watching my stuff and giving me input. Well, that's a good practice. And again, this is where institutions and communities come in, because and long-term relationships, because if via a long-term relationship and you trust this person, then you can hear criticism. And again, I deal with this all the time as a pastor, because in my line of work, here's this whole body of law that here are the standards that people should be upheld, and they're tremendously high standards, and pastor, these people aren't meeting the standards. You should go and call them to account. Okay, well, how will that go? And in many ways in the church, we know the amount of critique they can hear is directly dependent upon the amount that you have invested into their lives, and that they know that you are on their side. And then they might hear something. And that's again why trust is the lifeblood of relationship, and it's the lifeblood of the kind of communal formation that we all need.
I mean, I'd say the best faith you could find is your own friends. You know what I mean? And I mean, if you're there in it, I don't know that they can properly critique each other, but I don't know. There's some people, like, I don't know, maybe you're one of them who could, like, give a message for us who see some of these things. And that's the funny thing. The critique I have is that they don't take critiques. So yes. What do I do with that? What do you do with that? What do they do with that? And
again, our judgment, judgment is always something that we do to others. Our judgment of them is that they don't take critique. And I've seen this often between people. People will be like, well, they don't accept critique from me. Well, you don't think they're accepting critique from you, but some of that could be on your side too. This stuff is tremendously difficult.
He spoke about it, you said, like Sam and Eric.
Yeah, it would be helpful to know what those critiques are, I guess. I do think that there are some high quality critics out there that are probably not being engaged with at the moment. I think that the sort of constellation that seems to be around Arc Digital seems good to me.
Okay.
That, like, Arc Digital.
But I think, this business of relationships. So now, I've had some conversations with Jonathan Peugeot. I've had some conversations with John Vervaeke, and obviously because of what Jonathan Peugeot and I share in terms of Christian commitment, that's a little bit easier, and that's where the setting and the community is important. But my conversations with John Vervaeke, my watching him, I have a high level of trust for John because of how he carries himself, and how I see him relating interpersonally with others. And now that's via a thin screen at this point, but these are the things that over time build relationships, and these then open each other up to influence. We can hear each other, we can accept critique. This is what we're just got a text. Shouldn't be so distracted, but this is what we want to do.
Digital, from what I've seen, seems to be a sort of Quillette. Like Quillette, I really rate Quillette, and I rate a lot of stuff that they do, but Arc seems to have like a genuine ideological spectrum there.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Like they have Kathy Young, but they also have...
I think I want to jump ahead, because I'm running out of time, towards the end of this conversation.
Not a way that we can live. So something, that's the deeper inquiry, I think, of a lot of people on the channel, is something needs to go in the place of religion.
Right.
What we lost when we lost religion has never really been replaced, and somehow we need to put something else in that place. John Vervaeke thinks that whatever that is, it can't look like anything that from the past, because we've so destroyed the underlying mythological and psychological worldview that gave birth to those religious narratives that it will look completely different. But that's the deeper inquiry, I think. Like, how do we solve the meaning crisis? What goes in that space? And that's an open question.
That is, yeah. I'm trying to find people's perspectives on that, because I very much am like, don't know what you're gonna put in. Who's gonna make a new religion here, guys? Well, and that's it.
Yeah.
And this is obviously the part of the conversation I'm really interested in, and because I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I am a person who is practicing an established religion, and they're going to get into this a little bit more. But, and lately, if you're following my videos, I'm doing a lot more work on, okay, what do we mean by when we're using this word religion in this context? And again, a religion afforded a top-down, scalable, full world and life view. I'm using words from my tradition. A full world and life view that was one package, and it offered the community, the embeddedness, the 4 Ps. Even if we didn't have the language of the 4 Ps, it offered all of these things. And Andrea's a Christian, I'm a Christian. I think sometimes as Christians who are not downstream from the demythologizing, the disenchantment, and that can come philosophically in education, that can come relationally in breakdowns of marriage and family and communities. I don't remember the English term John Vervaeke uses, but I think deshogar, which is in Spanish the dehousing, where the domicile. It's a riff on the domicile. We're no longer home. We no longer inhabit this world. And of course, C.S. Lewis writes about that in his book, The Discarded Image. This is where we all are to a degree or not, and depending on where you are. Someone once mentions to me, Paul, you don't seem to have much of a meaning crisis. Well, yeah, but I can see it from my home, just like Sarah Payne can see Russia from her house. I can see the meaning crisis from my house. Because in many ways, I've continued to be deeply embedded within the church and within religion. And so it's easy. That's unfair too. It's not easy for Andrea and myself and Jonathan Pajot and others to say, "Oh, Christianity is a valid option," even though all three of us believe it, because we live it as a response to the meaning crisis. We also have to really listen seriously and deeply respect when others like David Fuller here says, "I don't know if I can go there." And John Vervaeke. I mean, to dismiss this from others who clearly, like David Fuller, like John Vervaeke, display virtue, display integrity, display honestly, to simply and easily dismiss them in this way is not a path forward.
Circling back to the IDW, there are a couple different perspectives within there. Like, I know Sam Harris thinks that you can put science in as the ideal with some meditation.
Yes.
And I don't want to represent him in the sense that maybe he sees meditation as that's the spiritual part, but the science is the thinking, cognitive part. And I know Brett Weinstein has said we need to replace religion with something, and been very vague about what.
Yes.
Just not Jesus, according to the past.
And in looking at some others in this realm, looking at Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, the three hoaxers, I've seen movement in terms of that they're not all three of them have told me, I'm not interested in debating religion. They're basically not interested in doing the atheist debates. That interests me and it encourages me, because this modernist on stage blood sport, yes God, no God, and I'll do some of that, but I've never been convinced it gets us much of anywhere. And the fact that those three are saying, all of them continue to maintain their atheist credentials, as it were, and I don't think their minds have changed with respect to the existence of God, whatever we mean by that. But the fact that, I'm bored with that conversation, which is very interesting. We don't think enough about that way of talking and the importance of that in terms of relevance, realization, and salience. But I think that's actually a sign of moving forward to have better conversations with each other. And so I'm actually encouraged by that.
Like little Twitter thing, although he did sort of say, I didn't quite understand what I was getting myself into.
Yeah.
So there is, I guess, for context, for those of you who aren't on Twitter, he was talking about how he made a plea to Christians to sort of do away with our hocus pocus part of our religion, the magic. I think he said magic, which lots of us. Sorry, I am a Christian, so that's why I'm saying us. You could say mysteries, and I think it wouldn't have been as upsetting, because there's mysteries in science too, right? But I think because he used the word magic, it was like, oh, okay, we're these heathens with our magical practices, but whatever.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting thing that happened over Twitter, though. There was a lot of pile-ons, but just seeing what was this sort of back and forth, and you can't actually take away, for people who have an existing religion and who exist within a framework, you can't take away these core elements, kind of like what you're saying about the baby out with the bathwater. Well, little baby Jesus is our baby. Right? So I don't know about I do
Talladega Nights, sweet little baby Jesus.
want to speak with John Vervaeke at some point, but these frameworks are so ancient within our human psyche, and you can't just throw it out. And so I don't know how we're going to come up with something new when that little suggestion over Twitter sent many a people in a tailspin, right? So that's why I'm like, I don't know what we're going to do with that.
Well, there's other people who've been on the channel, like Jonathan Pajot and Paul Vanderklay, who are very much focused on how do we renew Christianity. That's their solution is, and I'm open-minded about that. I feel like it feels unlikely to me that Christianity will fill that place.
And again, this is why Tom Holland's book is so important, because what Tom Holland is saying is that it really hasn't gone anywhere. And that's hard for the church to hear on one side. It's also hard for the unchurched to hear on the other side.
Why do you say that?
Andrea being the little evangelist here. I love it.
Because I just think that it's had its time, and I think that what we're seeing even with Jordan Peterson is a kind of integration of Christianity that's a kind of post-Christian perspective.
I
it's
agree
consciously
with that. Yeah.
It's not explaining Christianity away, but it is explaining a lot of it in a much more that's what I find really difficult about being around Christians. And I had this at I went to Paul Vanderklay's service.
Okay,
and
I've
had
spoken
this
with Paul.
experience.
Yeah, he's got an interesting way of.
Yeah.
He gets it. He's not like, what do you mean? Like, he gets what we're talking about.
Yeah, but I had that experience at his church where I was asked by someone whether I was a Christian, and I kind of went on this long discussion of that I appreciate it far more. I was actually brought up as a Methodist,
Oh,
but I
okay.
appreciate. So I had a religious upbringing, and I appreciate Christianity far more, mainly through listening to Jordan Peterson and kind of understanding the depth and the intelligence, like the profound nature of a lot of Christian thought. But I understand that sort of consciously, and that's what I find when I talk to a lot of Christians is that they talk in metaphor, and I'm like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean?
And the Christians don't know what they mean. And I think this is, oh wow, this is such an important point. I'm a pastor. I make these videos because I don't know what I mean. And I find that talking about it helps me know better. So that's why I talk. And who am I going to talk to? I got this tiny little dying church. And so I talk to you on the internet and you listen. And it's like, oh, I don't know why you listen, but it seems to be working. So we're going to keep doing it. And so I love this part of the conversation.
Mean by that? What does that mean? And it's like, but there is,
and you know, I actually now 2 years later have a far more profound appreciation for what Jordan Peterson, you know, what do we mean by when we say we believe in God? What do we know by believe, and what do we know by God? And so I think I think part of perhaps what David Fuller experienced when he was at Living Stones and he was asked by someone, you know, are you a Christian? And he has a long answer to that, which of course people at church are like, oh, I wasn't, we're just having coffee after church. Yes or no are fine. But David's working this stuff out and he's wrestling at it. And he'd have to, you know, short answer would be, well, no, I think, but raised as a Methodist. So how much of that Methodism is still in there? And probably a lot. And what does it mean to embrace or believe? And what doesn't it mean to believe? And Peterson says, I act as if. And, you know, 2 years in, I have probably more respect for that answer than I did before. Even though people found it unsatisfying, because what we're really doing is we're doing sort of a social thing and we're trying to categorize each other, trying to locate each other in terms of the tribes that we're at. But what we're in is this time of rapid change. And so we're all in these liminal spaces to some degree or another. And so we're working through these issues. And what I love about David here is that he's working through these issues and he's doing it in real time and he's doing it with integrity, and God bless him.
There is something very helpful about religion in that you can understand it at so many different levels. You don't need to, like, different segments of the population understand different parts of it, but it works on those multiple levels for different people. So there is something like,
this is the scale.
I see both sides. I have a skepticism that Christianity could be renewed because I think its time has probably passed. But at the same time, I recognize the challenge of putting something in that place when what was in that place was so deeply woven and I think whatever comes afterwards probably needs to integrate that tradition rather than replace it, certainly.
Okay.
So I'm going to leave it there. And he talks a little bit more about, you know, integral, Ken Wilber's spiral dynamics, and that mapping, and he critiques it a little bit. But anyway, the whole video is great. This was an amazing conversation. I deeply enjoyed it, as you could probably tell. And kudos to both of them for, you know, Ryan's idea that they are doing the IDW protocol in this video, and they're doing it well, and they're speaking honestly with sincerity, and I think this is good. I think this helps. I think this is part of the way forward. So, you know, thank you, both of you, Andrea and David, for having YouTube channels, for being willing to get on and be available and be honest and be open. And, you know, this is what we need to be doing. So thanks. And thank all of you for watching, because it's, you know, Andrea has about 1,300 subscribers, and the status stuff is difficult for us, and so you get to a point is like, well, is this worth doing? And so, you know, if you go to her video and you go to this video, I don't mean this video on my channel, but I'll have her link to her video below. Drop a comment, because when you've got 1,300 subscribers, you read all the comments because you're so grateful just for one. And I know, you know, some of the randos and such, they have subscribers in the 100, 200, 300, and Karen and the randos and Mary and JP, you know, encourage the little YouTubers and, you know, have them keep going, because be of good cheer, little church, because it's the Father's pleasure to give you the world.